Olivia Gray's breath caught as the letter slipped from her trembling fingers, floating to the dusty wooden floor of her father's general store like a fallen leaf. The elegant handwriting of Charles Montgomery, her fiancé of 3 years, revealed a truth more painful than she could have imagined. I have found my true calling and my true love in California. Our engagement is hereby terminated. Her world, once filled with promises of a comfortable future, shattered in an instant on that sweltering afternoon in June 1876. The small town of Willowcreek, Nebraska had never felt so suffocating. At 22, Olivia had given Charles everything: her heart, her trust, and even the precious family heirloom ring that had belonged to her grandmother. Now he was gone, taking her dreams and dignity with him, leaving nothing but whispers that followed her through town like persistent shadows. "Father," she said that evening, her voice steadier than she felt, "I cannot stay here." Jonathan Gray looked up from his ledger, the lines around his eyes deepening with concern. "Livy, you can't let that scoundrel drive you from your home." "It's not just Charles," she replied, twisting her now bare finger. "It's what comes next. The pitying glances. The gossip. I need something else. A new beginning." Her father's weathered hands closed the ledger with finality. "Your cousin Martha wrote last month. Her husband's homestead in Colorado Territory is prospering. Perhaps she could use your help." The journey west was arranged with surprising speed. Within a fortnight, Olivia found herself aboard a westbound train, her worldly possessions packed into 2 modest trunks. The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels seemed to echo her resolve: forward, always forward, never looking back. The Colorado Territory stretched before her like an untamed canvas when she disembarked at Silver Creek Station 3 days later. The mountains loomed majestic against the horizon, their snow-capped peaks touching a sky so vast and blue it made her heart ache with unexpected possibility. "Miss Gray?" A voice like rough gravel called from the platform's edge. "Martha sent me to fetch you." She turned to face a man whose appearance momentarily startled her. Tall and broad-shouldered, he stood beside a wagon, his face partially shadowed by a worn leather hat. Unlike the men of Willowcreek with their neat attire, this stranger wore dusty trousers tucked into scuffed boots, a faded blue shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbows revealing sun-bronzed forearms. "Yes, I'm Olivia Gray," she replied, straightening her travel-wrinkled skirt. "Blake Zimmerman," he offered simply, approaching to collect her trunks. "Ranch foreman for your cousin's husband. Their place is half a day's ride from here." As he lifted her trunks with surprising ease, Olivia noticed the calluses on his hands, the quiet efficiency of his movements, and most strikingly, the way he hardly glanced at her face, a refreshing change from the scrutiny she'd endured back home. The wagon journey stretched through breathtaking terrain, rolling foothills giving way to pine forests that scented the air with their sharp, clean fragrance. Blake Zimmerman proved to be a man of few words, answering her occasional questions with terse politeness. "Have you worked for my cousin's family long?" she ventured after an hour of near silence. 5 years, he replied, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Since Robert Thornton first claimed the land." "And do you?" she began, seeking any conversation to fill the stretching quiet. "Miss Gray," he interrupted, finally turning those startlingly blue eyes toward her. "I should warn you. Your cousin's place isn't what you might be expecting." A knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. "What do you mean?" His jaw worked for a moment before he answered. "Martha's been sick. The doctor from town comes when he can, but—" He let the words trail off, focusing again on the path. By late afternoon, the wagon crested a final hill, revealing a valley cradling a modest homestead, a main house of rough-hewn logs, a barn, and several outbuildings beside a creek that glinted silver in the fading light. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, but Olivia noticed immediately that the garden appeared overgrown, the fence in need of repair. A man emerged from the barn as they approached. Robert Thornton, Martha's husband of 7 years, though Olivia had never met him. His face was careworn beneath a shock of prematurely graying hair, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame. "Olivia," he called, helping her down from the wagon with gentle hands. "Thank God you've come. Martha's been asking for you." Inside the cabin, the reality Blake had hinted at became painfully clear. Martha lay in the bedroom, her once vibrant cousin now pale and thin, her eyes bright with fever. 2 children, a boy of about 6 and a girl perhaps 4, hovered uncertainly near their mother's bedside. "Livy," Martha whispered, a smile transforming her gaunt face. "You look just like Aunt Josephine now. So beautiful." Olivia knelt beside the bed, taking her cousin's hot hand in hers. "I'm here now," she said, pushing back the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "Everything will be fine." That night, after the children were asleep in their small adjoining room, Robert explained the situation in low, desperate tones. Martha had been ill with consumption for months. The doctor had little hope for recovery. The ranch was struggling. The last winter had been brutal, taking half their cattle. The children, Thomas and Eleanor, needed care that Robert couldn't provide while trying to save the ranch. "I wouldn't ask this of you," Robert said, his voice breaking. "But Martha insisted. She says you've always been strong, even as girls." Olivia thought of the letter from Charles, of her broken engagement, of how quickly she had fled her home. Strong was not how she would have described herself. Yet looking at the sleeping children, at this man's desperation, she felt something resolute stirring within her. "I'll stay," she promised. "For as long as you need me." The days that followed established a new rhythm to Olivia's life. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, tended to Martha, instructed the children in their letters and numbers, managed the household, and struggled to bring order to the neglected garden. The work was exhausting, leaving her muscles aching each night, yet she welcomed the physical fatigue that allowed her dreamless sleep. Blake Zimmerman appeared at the house each morning and evening, conferring with Robert about ranch matters in low, serious tones. He nodded politely to Olivia but rarely engaged in conversation beyond necessities. She found herself oddly conscious of his presence, the way he removed his hat upon entering the house, how he would quietly repair something broken without being asked, the gentle way he spoke to young Thomas and Eleanor when they crossed his path. 3 weeks after her arrival, Martha's condition worsened dramatically. The doctor was summoned from town, arriving in the middle of the night. By dawn, Martha was gone, leaving behind a husband shattered by grief and 2 confused, frightened children who turned to Olivia for comfort she wasn't sure how to provide. The funeral was held 2 days later, a small gathering of neighboring ranchers and townspeople paying their respects. Olivia stood beside Robert, holding Eleanor in her arms while Thomas pressed against her skirts, his small hand clutching the fabric like a lifeline. "You holding up all right, Miss Gray?" The low voice beside her belonged to Blake, his hat in his hands, his usually impassive face softened with concern. "I must," she replied simply. "For them." That evening, after the children were finally asleep, Robert found Olivia on the porch, staring at the star-filled sky that seemed impossibly vast compared to the view from her bedroom window in Nebraska. "I need to ask something unconscionable of you," he said without preamble. "Stay. Not just for a visit. Stay permanently." Olivia turned to him, startled. "Robert, not as my wife," he clarified quickly. "Never that. Martha was. She was everything. But the children need you. And I cannot manage them and save this ranch. If you stay, I'll deed you the small cabin by the creek. It needs work, but it could be yours. A place of your own. Independence." The word resonated through her. A place that belonged solely to her, not her father's house, not a future husband's home, but hers alone. "I'll stay," she said, the decision forming even as the words left her mouth. The small cabin Robert had mentioned stood a quarter-mile from the main house, nestled among cottonwood trees beside the creek. It had been built as a line shack before the main house was completed and had stood empty for years. The roof leaked, the windows were cracked, and field mice had clearly made themselves at home inside. "It's not fit for a lady," Blake commented the next morning when he found her assessing the structure, making mental lists of what needed to be done. "Then I suppose I'll have to be something other than a lady," Olivia replied, surprising herself with the edge in her voice. Besides, Mr. Zimmerman, you don't strike me as a man who underestimates what a woman can accomplish. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or respect. Fair enough, Miss Gray. Tell me what supplies you need, and I'll bring them from town next trip. Over the following weeks, the cabin slowly transformed. Olivia spent every spare moment between caring for the children and the main household working on her future home. Blake, to her surprise, often appeared in the evenings to help with the heavier tasks, replacing rotted floorboards, patching the roof, rebuilding the stone hearth. Their conversations, initially stilted, gradually flowed more easily as they worked side by side. She learned he had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, that he had a younger sister in Denver, that he could read Latin because his father had been a schoolteacher. "How did you end up here?" she asked one evening as they sat on the cabin's newly repaired porch steps, sharing coffee after a long day's work. Blake was silent so long she thought he might not answer. "I killed a man," he finally said, his voice flat. "In Virginia. He deserved it, was beating a woman half to death in an alley. But his family had money, influence. I ran." Olivia studied his profile in the fading light, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his temple. "You did what was right," she said quietly. "Maybe. But doing right doesn't always keep you safe." He stood abruptly. "Getting dark. I should see you back to the house." By early September, the cabin was habitable. Robert had gifted her with a bed frame and table from the main house, and Blake had crafted a rocking chair that sat perfectly beside the hearth. The day she moved in, carrying her few possessions across the meadow, she felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. Never had she lived alone, been responsible for herself alone. That night, she sat in her new home, listening to the creek's gentle murmur outside her window, and allowed herself to cry for the first time since receiving Charles's letter. She cried for Martha, for the children's loss, for her own shattered dreams, and finally, cleansingly, for the unexpected new path stretching before her. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She wiped her eyes hastily before opening it to find Blake standing there, a small wrapped package in his hands. "Housewarming," he said awkwardly, extending the gift. "Traditional, my mother would say." Inside the brown paper was a small carved wooden box with a hinged lid. On the top, delicate wildflowers had been etched into the polished wood. "It's beautiful," she whispered, genuinely touched. "For your keepsakes," he explained. "Every home needs a place for treasures." Impulsively, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a kiss to his weathered cheek. "Thank you, Blake." In the lamplight, she could have sworn he blushed before tipping his hat and retreating into the darkness. The autumn days settled into a routine. Olivia rose with the sun, walked to the main house to prepare breakfast, and help the children dress for the day. Eleanor, at 4, followed her like a shadow, while Thomas, more reserved, gradually came to trust her guidance. During the days, she taught them their lessons, managed the household accounts, and preserved food for the coming winter. Blake remained a constant presence, though his role seemed to expand beyond mere ranch foreman. Robert, still lost in grief, increasingly delegated responsibilities to him. It was Blake who rode to town for supplies, Blake who negotiated with cattle buyers, Blake who ensured the ranch hands were paid their due. And it was Blake who appeared at Olivia's cabin most evenings, sometimes with a practical purpose, more firewood, a repair to be made, but increasingly, it seemed, simply for her company. "You never speak of your life before," he observed one October evening as they sat before her hearth, she mending a tear in Thomas's shirt, he whittling a small wooden horse for Eleanor. Olivia's fingers stilled. "There's little to tell that matters now." "Something brought you here," he persisted gently. "Something beyond your cousin's need." She set aside her sewing, suddenly finding it difficult to meet his gaze. "I was engaged to be married. For 3 years I planned my future around a man who ultimately decided I wasn't worth keeping his promises." Blake's hands stopped their rhythmic movement on the carving. "He's a fool," he said, the words coming out rough and immediate. "Perhaps," she conceded. Or perhaps he simply saw clearly what I could not, that we weren't truly suited. Either way, I couldn't bear to stay and face the gossip, the pity. Coming here was escape, I suppose? And now? He asked, his blue eyes intent on her face. Is it still escape? Or something else? The question hung between them, weighted with meanings she wasn't ready to examine. Now it's home, she answered simply. Or becoming so. As winter approached, the ranch prepared for the harsh months ahead. Firewood was stacked, meat smoked, vegetables stored in the root cellar. Olivia knitted scarves and mittens for the children, patched quilts, and learned from neighboring women how to make soap and candles. The first heavy snow came in mid-November, transforming the landscape overnight into a glistening white expanse. Olivia awoke to find her path to the main house already cleared, Blake's bootprints visible in the freshly shoveled trail. Christmas approached with a poignancy Olivia hadn't anticipated. The children's excitement was tempered by their first holiday without their mother. Robert, though trying valiantly to engage with their preparations, often retreated into solitary grief. We should cut a tree, Blake suggested one afternoon in mid-December, appearing at the main house where Olivia was teaching the children to string cranberries. For the little ones. Thomas looked up, his eyes brightening for the first time in days. A real Christmas tree? With candles and everything? If Miss Olivia agrees, Blake replied, his gaze shifting to her. Please, Livy? Eleanor pleaded, using the affectionate name she'd adopted. Of course, Olivia smiled. Every Christmas needs a tree. That afternoon, Blake took Thomas with him into the forest, returning triumphantly with a perfect pine that filled the main house with its fresh, resinous scent. The decoration became a communal activity, with even Robert joining in, sharing stories of Christmas traditions from his own childhood. As the day itself approached, Olivia worked secretly on gifts: a doll with yarn hair for Eleanor, a carved wooden slingshot for Thomas, with Blake's help, a new journal for Robert. For Blake, she embroidered handkerchiefs, carefully stitching his initials in the corner of each. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. The children's delight in their simple gifts warmed the house more effectively than the blazing hearth. Robert presented Olivia with a lovely woolen shawl in deep blue, and to her surprise, a document transferring official ownership of the cabin and the surrounding 5 acres to her name. It's yours now, legally and truly, he said. As promised. Blake's gift to her, opened last as they sat around the remnants of Christmas dinner, brought tears to her eyes: a small framed drawing of her cabin, rendered with unexpected artistic skill, showing it not as it was, but as it could be, with a proper garden, flower boxes beneath the windows, a swing hanging from the largest cottonwood. For when spring comes, he explained quietly. So you can see the possibilities. Later, walking back to her cabin through the moonlit snow, Blake beside her carrying a lantern, Olivia felt a contentment she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. Thank you, she said as they reached her door. For the drawing. For seeing potential where others might not. I've had practice, he replied, his breath clouding in the cold air. Seeing value in things others overlook. The way he looked at her then, with intensity and something deeper she dared not name, made her heart quicken. For a breathless moment, she thought he might lean down to kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, clearing his throat. Merry Christmas, Olivia, he said, tipping his hat before turning toward the bunkhouse. Merry Christmas, Blake, she whispered to his retreating figure. January brought brutal cold and a series of blizzards that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Olivia moved temporarily back to the main house, unwilling to risk being separated from the children by impassable snow. The close quarters created a strange intimacy among the household: evenings spent reading aloud by lamplight, teaching the children games from her own childhood, listening to Robert's stories of his early days in the territory. Blake, too, spent more time indoors than was his custom, repairing equipment in the kitchen where it was warm, helping Thomas with woodworking projects, occasionally playing his harmonica after the children were asleep, the plaintive melodies speaking of longing and distant places. It was during one such evening, with Robert already retired and the children dreaming upstairs, that Blake finally asked the question Olivia had been half expecting, half dreading. "This man who broke your engagement," he began, setting aside his harmonica. "You loved him very much?" Olivia considered the question seriously, her hands stilling on the quilt she was binding. "I thought I did," she admitted. "But now, with distance, I think perhaps I loved the idea of him, the security he represented. Charles was respectable, from a good family. Our marriage would have been comfortable, expected. But not passionate," Blake observed. She felt heat rise to her cheeks. That would be an improper consideration for a well-bred lady. His low chuckle surprised her. "Yet you're sitting in a remote ranch house in Colorado Territory, rebuilding your life from scratch. I suspect propriety may have loosened its grip on you, Miss Gray." "Perhaps it has," she conceded with a small smile. "Though in truth, I'm not certain I knew what passion truly was then. And now?" His voice had dropped, the question hanging between them like a tangible thing. Olivia met his gaze steadily. "Now I believe I might recognize it, should I encounter it." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Blake leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers, when the sound of small feet on the stairs broke the moment. "Livy?" Eleanor appeared in her nightgown, rubbing her eyes. "I had a bad dream about Mama." Blake stood immediately. "I should check the stock before turning in," he said, gathering his coat. "Good night, Olivia." "Eleanor." Olivia gathered the child into her arms, whispering comforting words, even as her mind remained fixed on the interrupted moment, and what might have followed. February brought no relief from winter's grip. Supplies ran low, forcing Blake and one of the ranch hands to make a dangerous journey to town through deep snow. They returned 3 days later, half frozen but successful, with flour, coffee, sugar, and miracle of miracles mail that had accumulated at the general store. Among the letters was one addressed to Olivia in a hand she recognized immediately. Charles Montgomery. Her stomach clenched as she slipped it into her pocket, unnoticed by the others in the excitement of unpacking supplies. That night, alone in her small bedroom off the kitchen, she broke the seal with trembling fingers. "My dearest Olivia," the letter began, its formal tones so familiar it made her ache with remembered pain. Charles wrote of his deep regret for the manner of their parting, explaining that he had acted hastily, and had come to realize his profound mistake. The California venture had failed, the woman he had followed west had proven fickle and unsuitable. He was returning to Nebraska and hoped that Olivia, with her forgiving nature, might consider renewing their engagement. Olivia read the letter twice, then a third time, searching her heart for any flicker of the longing she would have expected mere months ago. Instead, she found only a hollow detachment, as though reading about strangers. The Charles she had idealized now seemed shallow, self-serving. The Olivia who had adored him felt equally foreign, a naive girl who had never tested her own strength. She was still holding the letter when a soft knock came at her door. Blake stood there, a steaming cup in his hand. "Thought you might want some tea before turning in," he said, then noticed her expression. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she replied automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, something unexpected. A letter from my former fiancé. He wishes to reconcile." Blake's face went carefully blank. "I see. And will you return to Nebraska?" Olivia looked down at the letter, then deliberately folded it and placed it on the small table beside her bed. "No," she said, the certainty in her voice surprising even herself. "That life, that person, isn't mine anymore." His shoulders relaxed visibly. "Good," he said simply, handing her the tea. "That's good." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a momentary touch that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the hot drink. Before she could respond, he nodded briefly and retreated, leaving her with the lingering impression that something significant had just transpired between them. March brought the first tentative signs of spring, patches of bare ground appearing through melting snow, longer daylight hours, the distant honking of geese returning north. Olivia moved back to her cabin, relishing the solitude after months of constant companionship, though she still spent her days at the main house with the children. Robert, emerging slowly from his grief, began taking a more active role in the ranch operations and the children's care. He spoke increasingly of his brother in Oregon, who had written repeatedly inviting him and the children to join his prosperous apple orchard business. "I've been considering it," he confided to Olivia one afternoon as they watched Thomas and Eleanor playing in the muddy yard. "A fresh start might be what we all need. Oregon is very far," Olivia observed, surprised by the conflicting emotions the idea stirred in her. She had grown to love the children deeply. The thought of their absence created a painful hollow in her chest. Yet she understood Robert's need to rebuild his life elsewhere, away from constant reminders of Martha. "It is," he agreed. "But before I could consider such a move, I would need to know the ranch is in good hands." He gave her a meaningful look. "Blake has expressed interest in buying it, if I decide to go. He's saved almost enough." "Blake?" The news startled her. "He's never mentioned such plans. He's a private man," Robert said. "But he loves this land as much as I ever did. Maybe more." He paused, studying her face. "I think there might be other reasons he'd want to stay as well." Olivia felt her cheeks warm under his knowing gaze but said nothing. The decision came more quickly than anyone anticipated. A letter arrived from Oregon describing a neighboring property available for purchase, ideal for Robert's needs, but requiring a commitment by May. After a week of careful consideration and long talks with the children, he made his choice. They would go west as soon as the mountain passes cleared, likely in late April. The news transformed the ranch's atmosphere. There was a flurry of activity, decisions about what to take and what to sell, preparations of the wagon and team, letters to send. Through it all, Blake remained oddly distant, focused on spring calving and fence repairs, often returning to the bunkhouse after Olivia had already retired to her cabin. A week before their planned departure, Robert finalized the sale of the ranch to Blake, signing the papers brought by a lawyer from town. That evening, they celebrated with a special dinner, the children excited despite their uncertainty about the journey ahead. "To new beginnings," Robert toasted, raising his glass. "For all of us." Later, as Olivia prepared to walk back to her cabin, Blake appeared beside her, offering his arm. "I'll see you home," he said, the familiar phrase now carrying new weight in the context of changing circumstances. They walked in silence through the spring evening, the air sweet with the scent of new growth and possibility. At her door, Olivia turned to face him, determined to break through the strange barrier that had formed between them. "You never told me you planned to buy the ranch," she said directly. Blake shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't certain until recently." "And now that it is?" she pressed. "What are your plans?" He looked out toward the darkening land, his profile strong against the deepening blue of the sky. "Build something lasting. Something that's mine, that can't be taken away." "Alone?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider its implications. His eyes returned to her face, searching. "That depends," he said quietly. "On what?" "On whether certain people might consider their future here as well." Olivia's heart quickened. "Blake, I'm not good with words, Olivia," he interrupted. "Never have been. But these past months, watching you rebuild your life, your strength after what that fool did to you." He took a deep breath. "You deserve someone who sees your worth. Who would never betray your trust. Someone like you," she whispered. "If you could consider it," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Not right away. I know you value your independence, this place you've made your own. But someday, perhaps." Olivia reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I've already considered it," she admitted. "More than you know." When he finally kissed her, it was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. Then, as she responded, It deepened into something that answered the question she'd posed months ago. Yes, this was passion, this breathless certainty, this feeling of coming home to a place she'd never been before. The days that followed were bittersweet. Preparations for Robert and the children's departure continued, now overlaid with the tentative, joyful beginnings of what was growing between Olivia and Blake. They spoke of possibilities, of the future, of transforming the ranch into something that would reflect both their dreams. "I won't ask you to give up your cabin," Blake told her as they walked the property one evening, discussing potential improvements. "That's yours, your independence. But perhaps, in time, we might build something new. Together." The idea took root in her imagination, a home of their own design, large enough for the family they might create, yet keeping her beloved cabin as a reminder of her journey towards self-reliance. The morning of departure arrived clear and cool, the wagon loaded, the children subdued but excited. Olivia held Eleanor tightly, whispering promises to write, to visit when possible. Thomas, trying to be brave, shook Blake's hand solemnly before allowing Olivia to embrace him. "You'll be happy here?" Robert asked quietly as he prepared to climb onto the wagon's seat. "With Blake? I believe I will," she answered honestly. "He's a good man." "The best I know," Robert agreed. "Martha would be pleased. She always hoped you'd find someone worthy of you." As the wagon pulled away, the children waving until they were tiny figures on the distant trail, Olivia felt Blake's steady presence beside her, his hand finding hers. "It's just us now," he said softly. "Us and 1,000 acres," she corrected with a small smile, squeezing his fingers. "And a future to build," he added. The days lengthened into summer. Blake moved from the bunkhouse into the main house, while Olivia maintained her residence in the cabin, a compromise that raised eyebrows among some neighbors but felt right to them both. Their courtship progressed with a deliberate pace that honored both their growing feelings and their individual needs for certainty after past wounds. Olivia planted her garden as Blake had envisioned in his Christmas, drawing vegetables for practicality, flowers for beauty. She helped with ranch operations, discovering an aptitude for bookkeeping and a surprising enjoyment of working alongside Blake with the livestock. Together they planned improvements: a new barn, expanded grazing areas, eventually an orchard of hardy apple varieties. Letters arrived regularly from Oregon, filled with news of the children's adjustment and Robert's promising new venture. Occasionally, mail came from Nebraska as well, her father's business updates, town gossip, and once, a newspaper clipping announcing Charles Montgomery's marriage to a banker's daughter from Omaha. Olivia read it with a detached curiosity, realizing the news stirred no emotion beyond a vague sense of gratitude for the path his rejection had ultimately led her to discover. On a perfect evening in late August, Blake asked her to ride with him to the western ridge of the property. They arrived as the sun was beginning to set, casting long golden light across the valley that held their ranch, their home. "I wanted you to see it from up here," he explained as they dismounted. "All of it." Spread below them was the ranch in its entirety, the main house and outbuildings, the corrals where cattle gathered, the lush hayfields, and in the distance, her cabin beside the silver thread of the creek, smoke rising gently from its chimney. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "It's more than land," Blake said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "It's possibility. Future." He turned to face her directly. "Olivia Gray, I love you. Not just for your strength or your beauty, though God knows you possess both in abundance. I love your heart, your mind, the way you've rebuilt your life on your own terms." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that caught the last sunlight. Not a ring, as she had half expected, but a key, newly made, gleaming brass. "This is for the house," he explained. "Not a demand or expectation. An invitation. Marry me, Olivia. Build a life with me. Keep your cabin, your independence, but share my home, my name, my future." Olivia took the key, its weight solid and real in her palm. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the pain of betrayal, the grief, the hard work of creating something new from broken pieces. And through it all, this man beside her, who had never asked her to be less than she was, only offered partnership in becoming more. Yes, she said simply, and then again with rising joy. Yes, Blake Zimmerman. I will marry you. He gathered her into his arms then, their kiss a promise against the backdrop of the land that had become their shared love. They married in October, when the aspen leaves turned gold and the air carried the first hint of winter's approach. The ceremony was small but joyful, held in the garden Olivia had cultivated beside her cabin. Robert returned for the occasion, bringing Thomas and Eleanor, whose excited chatter filled the ranch with familiar warmth. Neighbors attended, along with Blake's sister from Denver and, to Olivia's surprise, her father, who traveled west to give his daughter away with tears in his usually stern eyes. You were right to leave, Jonathan Gray told her the night before the wedding. Look what you've found by being brave enough to start again. The wedding night found them in the main house, now transformed by their shared vision, new curtains at the windows, comfortable furniture arranged before the hearth, Blake's books mingling with Olivia's on shelves he had built with his own hands. Welcome home, Mrs. Zimmerman, he said as he carried her across the threshold. One of my homes, she corrected with a smile. I seem to have acquired two. And my heart makes three, he replied, setting her gently on her feet. Though that's been yours for longer than you know. Their life together unfolded with the rhythm of the seasons. The ranch prospered under their combined care, Blake's practical knowledge and Olivia's organizational skills proving a formidable partnership. Her cabin became a guest house when Robert and the children visited each summer, and later, a quiet retreat where she wrote stories of frontier life that eventually found their way to publishers in Denver and even New York. Their first child, a daughter, arrived the following August, born in the main house with Blake pacing anxiously outside until the midwife's triumphant announcement. They named her Martha, honoring the cousin whose need had brought Olivia west. A son followed 2 years later, strong and steady like his father. On the 5th anniversary of their marriage, Blake presented Olivia with a surprise, a carefully crafted wooden box, larger than the one he'd given her as a housewarming gift, but clearly made by the same hands. Open it, he urged. Inside, she found documents, the deed to the ranch, now listed in both their names, and something unexpected, the title to 5 adjoining acres surrounding her original cabin, purchased from a neighboring property. I thought we might plant an orchard there, he explained. Something that connects both our homes, that will grow for our children, and their children after them. Olivia looked at this man who had helped her rebuild not just a home, but a life, who had seen her strength when she doubted it herself, who had offered partnership instead of possession, love without conditions. Do you ever wonder, she asked, leaning against his solid warmth, what would have happened if Charles hadn't broken our engagement? If I'd never come west? Blake considered the question seriously. I believe some things are meant to be, despite the painful paths that lead us there. He betrayed your trust, yes. But that betrayal led you here, where you could begin again. His arms tightened around her. And I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret that journey. Outside their window, the Colorado sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of promise. On the ridge where he had proposed, the first saplings of their orchard caught the fading light, new growth taking root in soil made richer by all that had come before.